So part three um, is how to determine and discern your limitations. This is a relatively short section, so depending on how short it is, I may combine it with part four because the two are kind of related. Um, so in this sort of emergency situation, you will find yourself in situations potentially where you might have to make snap decisions on what you need to do, what you have to do, what you might not have to do. And so there is a balance between what I would call being noble and what I would call noble idiocy. There is a possibility that one can be so noble as to completely be reckless and not actually achieve that which you want to achieve. And you have to have a keen sense of what you can and cannot handle. You have to be able to pray and seek what God is calling you to do. And that's sometimes is hard, since sometimes you just may not know what you don't know. We do know that our calling as healthcare professionals is to help people, right? That's why we're doing this. But we have to be able to know when enough is enough. And what do I mean by that? You can't be forced into a situation, for instance, that puts you in an unacceptable risk. There are stories I've heard about people being asked to go see coronavirus positive patients with virtually no PPE on, or they're called to run into a code with no training, no direction, and no supervision. So and actually, just as a quick aside, to those of you who've just joined in, please mute yourselves and also hide your video. We're trying to maintain bandwidth. We are so grateful that there are so many of you that are on, but we're also trying to maintain bandwidth, so thank you. You can ask questions through the chat, which is available, and then Dr. Christine Gabriel will process these questions at the end of each section. We're in part three right now, and that is the part related to how to determine and discern your limitations. So, as I was saying before, you cannot be forced into a situation that puts you at an unacceptable risk. And there are going to be times when you might have to do something to save the life of the patient and calculate that risk. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in the next section, but I say I'm focusing on this in this particular section on making sure that we are aware that we actually do have limitations. If you're a medical student, you're not expected to make a life-saving decision on a patient. Even if you're the only one in the room at the time, you shouldn't be making a decision on the patient if the patient suddenly starts to crash. You should open your door, run and get help from people who have more training in that, and let them take care of the situation, let them handle, even if it's a few seconds delay. Try not to do mouth-to-mouth on somebody who's coronavirus positive. That's just not needed anymore in a hospital. Why do I say these outlandish things? Because I've heard people talk about being tempted to do these things in the heat of the moment, which is why I'm saying this right now. Always be aware of your circumstances. Always be aware of your limitations. When I was a Boy Scout, the first thing that I was taught in my life-saving merit badge and my first aid training was you have to be able to be alive to rescue somebody. If you jump in to save somebody who's drowning and you yourself are not prepared to save that person, then there will be 2 drowned people in that lake instead of just 1. So please make sure you know your limitations and are ready to preserve yourself in the process of helping other people. Otherwise, you will be no help to anyone. Now, as a preface and a guide into the next section, because I think I will mix the two up together into one session, I've referenced here the Good Samaritan parable, and I also put the biblical reference for it. It's Luke chapter 10, verses 29 to 37. If you have time and if you happen to have a Bible handy, you can turn to it. If you don't, I assume that everyone knows the basics of the story. There's a Good Samaritan, there's a Jewish merchant who's on his way on the Jericho Road. He gets beset by a bunch of robbers, is left for dead. A priest and a Levite pass him by, but a Samaritan comes by and takes care of him, brings him to an innkeeper, and has the innkeeper take care of him and goes on his way. That's a very, very basic gist of the story. So that's the story we all hear about. But then if you look at the story closer, there's 4 things we learn about the Good Samaritan that I think Jesus highlights in some way, shape, or form. And these 4 things help to determine how we need to approach both doing what we're called to do in helping people because we're physicians or we're other forms of health professionals that are on this video meeting right now. But we do it in a way that reminds us of our limitations. So the four things that we can learn about the Good Samaritan are, first, he helped a stranger. We're all going to be helping strangers, people that we just have no clue where they came from. They could be rich, they could be poor, they could be somewhere in between. Maybe they're LGBTQI, ABC, XYZ. Who knows? But we do know that at the very moment, we are in front of someone who was at least initially created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, if you will, of Genesis chapter 2, verse 27. You'll hear me refer to that a few more times in the next couple of minutes. And because the person that's in front of us is in the Imago Dei, in the image of God, we need to make sure that we help them, whether we know them or not. So the first thing that the Samaritan did was that he helped the stranger. The second thing the Samaritan did was he helped a stranger who happened to be an enemy of his people. Remember, Samaritans at the time were viewed as a mongrel race. So, the Jews thought themselves relatively superior to them at that time in history. And so the Samaritans and Jews basically didn't get along with each other at all. So Jesus is pointing out that this Samaritan was willing to help somebody who he really didn't have any good reason to like. The third thing he did was that he took care of this stranger who was an enemy of his people at great risk to himself. There are some contemporary sources that say that the Jericho Road mortality at the time was close to 50%. So this man was taking a significant risk in stopping on that road to take care of someone who was just beat up by robbers a short while ago. So that was the third thing, right? He took care of this stranger who was an enemy of his people at considerable risk to himself. And then fourth, he gave all that he had, right? Because if you either are reading the story right now, or you remember the story, he goes to the innkeeper with this victim. He tells the innkeeper to take care of him. He gives him everything he's got in his wallet and says, "Listen, I pass this way, quite frequently. You know who I am. Next time I come back, you tell me how much extra it costs you to take care of this man, and I will pay you that." So he basically gave all that he had to take care of that person. So in a different part of Jesus' teachings, he condenses all his commandments, all the commandments of the New Testament, all the commandments of the Old Testament, and he condenses it into one major commandment that's in one verse, and that's in John 13:34. Right? "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. As I, Jesus, have loved you, that you also should love one another." Now we're in Holy Weekend. Good Friday was yesterday, Easter's tomorrow. So more than any other time, although we should be thinking of this all year long, but more than any other time, we should be consciously aware of how far Jesus went to take care of us when we were lying, doomed to be dead on the road to Jericho. So in that same vein, we need to prayerfully think about how we're going to be taking care of our patients and what decisions we may need to make in order to take care of them.